Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're exploring how the sheer physical landscape of Sri Lanka forged its ancient civilizations. And honestly, it's incredibly rich cultural tapestry too. I'm super excited to guide you through this wild relationship between the earth beneath our feet and human history. We're going to see how geology literally dictates destiny. So here's our roadmap. We're taking a journey from the very bedrock of the island all the way up to the complex human societies that settled there. We'll look at its ancient origins, the dramatic climate divide, the soil that made agriculture possible, the demographics, and finally, the shifting historical powers. All right, part 1. The island's ancient origins, severing from the subcontinent. So our story starts right at the literal foundation. Way back, this landmass was actually attached to the South Indian Shield. It was part of that massive supercontinent Gondwanaland. But then, roughly 25,000 years ago, which in geological time is practically yesterday, Sri Lanka finally separated from the Indian mainland. It created this narrow strip of water called the Palk Strait. It's less than 23 miles wide, but man, it created a totally distinct geographical isolation. And that insularity, it's absolutely crucial, because it allowed a completely unique civilization to bloom over the next couple millennia. And beneath that isolated landmass, we have this rugged, heavy foundation. Literally, 9/10 of Sri Lanka is built on hard, ancient Precambrian crystalline rock. We're talking granites, gneisses, schists, the whole shebang. Topographically, this ancient rock pushes up to form this massive inverted T, or kind of like an anchor shape of really rugged highlands right in the south-central part of the island.
Moving right along to part 2, a tale of two zones, the climate divide.
Now, because of how those central mountains act like a massive wall blocking the monsoon winds, the island is basically split into two starkly different climatic zones. It's a huge contrast. On one side, you've got a lush wet zone down in the southwest that just gets hammered with heavy rainfall, creating these dense tropical rainforests. But then, pitted against that is a massive parched dry zone that covers a staggering 70% of the island, mostly characterized by harsh, thorny scrub. Which brings us to part 3, the reddish-brown earths, laying the groundwork. Okay, so this wild climate divide gives us a genuinely fascinating puzzle for human settlement. Think about it. You're faced with almost impenetrable, deep rainforest in the wet zone on one hand, and harsh, thorny scrub in the massive dry zone on the other. So where on earth did the ancient people of Sri Lanka actually build their great, flourishing societies? Well, the answer is literally in the dirt itself, specifically the reddish-brown earths of the dry zone. Yeah, the dry zone lacked year-round rain, but these specific reddish-brown soils were uniquely chemically fertile. They were absolutely perfect for kickstarting early agriculture. You see, early settlers purposefully steered clear of those wet zone rainforests. They were just way too thick, too hard to clear out. And even within the dry zone, they cleverly bypassed these highly permeable, completely infertile soils known as red-yellow latisols. Instead, they completely zeroed in on those reddish-brown earths for irrigated rice cultivation. And to beat that harsh, dry climate, they engineered massive surface storage tanks, basically giant artificial lakes, just to trap the monsoon rains and keep their crops watered all year round. Talk about a real game changer. All right, part 4, the people of Sri Lanka, a demographic tapestry. Now, looking at the folks who actually populated this island over the millennia, the demographics are primarily made up of the Sinhalese at roughly 70%. Then we have Tamils, and that includes both Sri Lankan and Indian Tamils at 22%, and Muslims making up just over 7% of the population. And the religious landscape is just as diverse, you know? We've got Buddhists at roughly 67%, Hindus at nearly 18%, Christians hovering around 8%, and Muslims at about 7%. Now, while the historical origins of these different groups get intensely debated in modern political discourse today, the historical sources actually show us something really cool. Both major linguistic groups share deeply intertwined cultural and ethnic roots stretching back centuries. We are way more connected than we sometimes think. And that brings us to part 5, a tapestry of history, shifting powers. From those deep agricultural roots in the dry zone, the island goes through these massive, profound political shifts. Tradition marks the arrival of Vijaya way back around the 6th century BC. Then, by the 3rd century BC, Buddhism arrives, which really solidifies the Sinhalese identity. And get this, for over a millennium, the dry zone was the undisputed center of power. Great kingdoms were operating out of Anuradhapura, but then things changed.
Successive invasions, first by the Cholas in the 11th century who shifted the capital to Polonnaruwa, and then the Maga invasion in the 13th century, sparked a massive geographic and political shift. It eventually led to the total decline of that ancient dry zone civilization. So, following that decline, Sinhalese power started drifting away from the north and east, down into the wet zone in the southwest. And this happened just in time for centuries of European colonial rule to kick off. The Portuguese showed up in the 16th century, finding a pretty divided island. They were pushed out by the Dutch in the 17th century, who were then replaced when the British took control in 1795. This whole colonial era lasted until 1948, which is when Sri Lanka finally became a fully independent power. Now, here's the crazy part. This whole historical trajectory basically completely flipped the physical layout of human life on the island. Think about it. While ancient life was strictly centered in the dry zone's reddish-brown earths to support vast agricultural empires, today, the dynamic is exactly the opposite. 60% of the modern population and a whopping 75% of its urban centers now thrive right there in the wet zone lowlands. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with this pretty powerful thought from our sources. The form of a land surface is one of the fundamental geographical factors affecting the course of human history. It makes you wonder, right? If the very bedrock, the monsoons, and the reddish-brown soil beneath our feet dictated the rise and fall of ancient civilizations, how is our rapidly changing modern environment going to shape the future destiny of Sri Lanka? Thank you so much for exploring this explainer with me today, and remember, always keep questioning the ground you walk on.